The Middle Ages. When you hear that, you probably think of knights, castles, maybe a plague or two. It's often written off as just this dark, boring gap between the glory of Rome and the genius of the Renaissance. But what if that's all wrong? What if this millennium of chaos was actually the very place our modern world was born? Let's find out.
So, picture this. It's the year 400. The Roman Empire is the only game in town. It's huge, it's powerful, it stretches all the way from Britain to the Middle East. To anyone living then, it must have seemed like it would last forever.
Well, it didn't. Just 100 years later, the entire western half of that empire had completely collapsed. The order that held Europe together for centuries, it just shattered. Cities were looted, trade disappeared, and an entire way of life was right on the brink of extinction. And that's the big question, isn't it? When a world completely falls apart, what comes next? How do people even start to rebuild? What new ideas, what new powers, and what new ways of living can possibly crawl out of that kind of total collapse? The end of Rome wasn't a single event. It was more like a slow-motion catastrophe that lasted for a century. You had all these Germanic tribes, the Goths, the Vandals, pushing deeper and deeper into the empire and pretty much leaving destruction everywhere they went. And you have to think about the psychological shock here. When Rome itself was sacked in 410, it sent a tremor through the whole system. I mean, if the eternal city could fall, was anywhere really safe? By 476, when the last emperor was kicked out, the answer was pretty clear. The old world was officially over. But here's where you see this crazy split. While the West was just crumbling into dust, the Eastern Roman Empire, the part we now call the Byzantine Empire, was doing just fine. It was wealthy, stable, and it kept Roman law and Greek knowledge alive for another 1,000 years. That divide is absolutely crucial, and it's going to shape the rest of history. Okay, so the old world is gone. How do you even begin to rebuild? Well, out of all that chaos, a new way to live had to be invented. And this new order, it was built on two really powerful pillars that would define the next 1,000 years: Christian faith and a political system called feudalism. With the Roman government gone, there was this huge power vacuum. And who stepped in to fill it? The church. Bishops became these local leaders, organizing defenses, feeding people, and maybe most importantly, it was the monks in their monasteries who saved literacy and all the old books from Greece and Rome, books that would one day light the fire of the Renaissance. But, faith alone can't stop a Viking axe. After a brief attempt to rebuild an empire under a guy named Charlemagne fell apart, Europe was plunged back into chaos. You had raiders coming from every direction. So the question on everyone's mind was, if the king is too far away to protect me, who will? And the answer they came up with was feudalism. Now, this wasn't some grand theory someone wrote down. It was a gritty, practical local solution to constant danger. Power wasn't in one central place anymore. The basic idea was simple. Land, which was the only real wealth, was traded for a promise of military protection. It basically worked like a pyramid of loyalty. The king would grant huge chunks of land to his top lords. Those lords would then grant smaller pieces to local knights. In return, the knights provided the muscle, protecting the peasants who worked the land. And those peasants, the serfs, were tied to the land, trading their freedom and their labor for one thing: safety. It was a tough bargain, for sure, but it brought some order back to a really violent world. Okay, so fast forward a bit. By the 11th century, this new system has kind of settled down. Europe's population is growing, and so is its confidence. And all that new energy, well, it started to look outward. For the first time in centuries, European Christendom went on the attack. And this wasn't just about the Holy Land. Yeah, the First Crusade kicked off in 1096 to capture Jerusalem, but at the exact same time, you had Christian kingdoms in Spain fighting to push back Muslim rule in the Reconquista, and German knights were expanding east along the Baltic. This was a massive continent-wide military push. But here's the thing about war: it always has these unexpected side effects. Through all this conflict, Europe came into contact with the much more advanced Muslim world, and suddenly, knowledge that had been lost for centuries started flowing back west. We're talking Greek philosophy, Indian mathematics, including our numbers and the concept of zero, and all kinds of new technology. So after centuries of growth, the 14th century brought everything to a screeching halt. Seriously, it was a perfect storm of disasters. You had climate change causing famine, endless wars draining everyone's money, and then something far, far worse arrived. A catastrophe that would change everything. It started in 1347. Word came from trading posts on the Black Sea of a terrifying new sickness. It spread with unbelievable speed, carried on merchant ships by fleas on rats. It was the bubonic plague, but it would soon get a much more famous name: the Black Death. The death toll? It's just staggering. In just a few years, the Black Death killed somewhere between a third and a half of the entire population of Europe. Just let that sink in. We're talking about entire villages just being wiped off the map.
A disaster this big completely flipped the script on the social order. Before the plague, you had way more workers than jobs, so peasants had no power. But after, labor was suddenly incredibly rare and valuable. If you survived, you could actually demand wages, leave your land, and bargain for your freedom. For Western Europe, this was the beginning of the end for serfdom. So what do you do after the world breaks? Well, the survivors of the 14th century didn't just try to glue the old pieces back together. They built something entirely new. The very crises they'd been through, the plague, the wars, actually sped up the changes that would finally push Europe into the modern age.
You can see it in how they fought wars. For centuries, the battlefield was dominated by the armored knight on horseback, the symbol of the whole feudal system. But in the Hundred Years' War, it became clear his time was over. A common foot soldier with a longbow, and later a simple cannon, could take him down.
And that's the real game changer. Gunpowder didn't just change battles. It changed everything. Cannons could literally knock down the castle walls that were the whole basis of a local lord's power. Suddenly, power was shifting back to kings, the only ones who could afford all this new military tech. By the mid-1400s, you can see all the pieces of our modern world starting to fall into place. In Italy, the Renaissance is exploding with new art and science. In Portugal, explorers are kicking off the Age of Discovery. And in 1453, when Constantinople finally falls to the Ottoman Empire, that's the final end of the Roman legacy. It also pushes Europeans to find new ways to get to Asia by sea, and boom, the age of global exploration is on. The medieval world is over. So that leaves us with a pretty big idea to think about. We always look for the roots of our modern lives in the neat, rational world of the Enlightenment. But maybe the real foundations, our nations, our science, our global economy, weren't born in an age of reason at all. Maybe they were actually hammered out, piece by painful piece, in the fire and chaos of a 1,000-year-long struggle to build a new world from the ashes of the old.